A corporate executive harasses a flight attendant on a first-class flight, grabbing her wrist and making vile threats while passengers look away in fear. The wealthy bully thinks his money makes him untouchable as he humiliates the young woman at 30,000 feet. But the quiet passenger in seat 2A isn't just another traveler. This is Mike Tyson himself. The executive has no idea he just assaulted someone in front of a man who spent decades destroying opponents with his bare hands. While the corporate predator tightens his grip and makes disgusting demands, the boxing legend rises from his seat with deadly calm. Other passengers recognize their savior and step back, knowing justice is about to be served. The bully keeps running his mouth, thinking his wealth protects him, but he's actually facing down one of the most feared fighters in history. What happens when you pick the wrong fight on the wrong flight? Will the executive survive learning why some legends never need to prove themselves twice? What happened next would terrorize the corporate bully for the rest of his pathetic existence. Before we jump back and tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Flight 447 rolled down the runway at McCarran International Airport, its engines humming with the promise of a routine afternoon journey to New York. The Las Vegas heat shimmered off the tarmac as the Boeing 737 gained speed, leaving the desert city behind for the 3,000-mile journey east, in the first class cabin. Flight attendant Diane Martinez moved through her safety demonstration with practiced efficiency. At 28, she carried herself with the professional grace that came from years of service, but her alert eyes suggested something more than typical airline training. She scanned each passenger with the subtle thoroughness of someone accustomed to reading people and situations. The cabin was half full with the usual mix of business travelers and tourists. Elderly couple Frank and Betty Kowalski sat in 4C and 4D, their wedding rings worn smooth by 43 years of marriage. Frank's weathered hands and observant eyes hinted at a lifetime of seeing too much, while Betty's gentle demeanor masked a sharp intelligence that missed very little. In seat 2A, a large black man in his late 50s sat quietly reading The Art of War. His massive frame made the first-class seat look small, but he seemed perfectly at ease, dressed casually in dark jeans and a quality polo shirt. Most passengers didn't give him a second glance, clearly a man who preferred to keep to himself. The peace was shattered when Bradley Vanderkamp rushed aboard just before departure. The 45-year-old pharmaceutical executive looked expensive in his tailored suit, but his face was flushed with anger as he barked into his phone about delayed meetings and incompetent subordinates. "This seat better be perfect," Vanderkamp snapped at Diane as he threw his carry-on into the overhead bin. "I pay for first-class service, and I expect first-class treatment." Diane smiled professionally. "Of course, sir. We'll take excellent care of you today." But Vanderkamp was already demanding she move his luggage, fetch him a drink before takeoff, and adjust the cabin temperature. His voice carried throughout the first-class section, drawing uncomfortable glances from other passengers. Frank Kowalski's jaw tightened as he watched the display, while Betty placed a calming hand on his arm. The man in 2A glanced up from his book, his dark eyes tracking the interaction with the focused attention of someone who had spent a lifetime reading dangerous situations. His scarred knuckles, hands that had known both violence and restraint, carefully turned a page as he continued to observe. As the plane reached cruising altitude 30 minutes later, the cabin settled into the quiet rhythm of a cross-country flight. But the peace was fragile. Vanderkamp's call button chimed insistently for the third time in 10 minutes, and Diane approached his seat with the patience of a professional who had dealt with difficult passengers before, though perhaps not in the context others might expect. The atmosphere in the cabin held the electric tension that comes before a storm, and the quiet passenger in 2A seemed to sense it most of all. "This scotch tastes like it came from a plastic bottle," Vanderkamp declared loudly, holding up his empty glass as Diane approached. "Bring me something that costs more than your hourly wage." His voice carried through the first-class cabin with deliberate cruelty, ensuring every passenger heard his disdain. The wealthy executive seemed to feed off the discomfort he created, his eyes glittering with the satisfaction of someone who believed money gave him the right to humiliate others. The man in seat 2A continued reading, but his body language shifted subtly, the controlled stillness of a predator becoming alert. When Diane returned with top-shelf liquor, Vanderkamp made her wait while he slowly examined the bottle, then criticized the poor amount with theatrical disgust. "I suppose this will have to do," he said with exaggerated resignation. "Though I've had better service at truck stops." Frank Kowalski muttered something under his breath about entitled bullies, earning a warning squeeze from Betty. Across the aisle, the large passenger's hands that had known both championship glory and street-level survival, remained steady as he turned another page. But his attention was fully focused on the developing situation. Vanderkamp's phone buzzed constantly, and he answered each call with increasing agitation, speaking loudly about shipment delays and delivery schedules in terms that seemed more suited to cargo than legitimate business. His voice carried an edge of desperation beneath the arrogance. "The containers better be ready," he hissed into the phone. "I don't care what it costs. Everything moves tonight." When Diane walked past to check on other passengers, Vanderkamp's eyes followed her with predatory intent. He waited until she was close enough for everyone to hear, then made a deliberately crude comment about her appearance that was vile enough to make Betty gasp and Frank start to rise from his seat. "Some women know their place," Vanderkamp continued, his voice dripping with malicious satisfaction. "Others need to be taught." The comment hung in the air like poison, creating a collective intake of breath from witnesses who couldn't believe what they'd just heard. Frank's hands clenched into fists as decades of police instincts screamed at him to act, but Betty's firm grip on his arm reminded him of his age and limitations. That's when the book in seat 2A closed with a soft but definitive thud. The sound was barely audible, but it seemed to shift something fundamental in the cabin's atmosphere. For the first time, passengers could see the man's face fully, calm, controlled, but with eyes that had witnessed too much injustice to tolerate this kind of behavior. He didn't move from his seat yet, but every person in the first-class cabin could feel that something had changed. The wealthy bully continued his tirade, oblivious to the fact that he had just crossed a line in front of someone who had spent a lifetime ensuring that bullies faced consequences for their actions. 30 minutes into the flight, Vanderkamp's behavior had deteriorated from merely obnoxious to genuinely threatening. 3 drinks had loosened whatever restraints wealth and social position normally imposed on his true nature. His phone calls had become more frequent and urgent, filled with references to shipments and delivery schedules that made Frank's police instincts scream danger. "I don't care about their complaints," Vanderkamp snarled into his phone, his voice carrying throughout the cabin. "The girls are cargo. Treat them like it." The words hit Frank like a physical blow. 40 years of working missing persons cases had taught him to recognize the language of human trafficking, and every alarm bell in his experienced mind was ringing. He caught Betty's eye and saw his own horrified understanding reflected there. When Diane approached to remind Vanderkamp about airline phone policies and ask him to lower his voice, the executive's mask of civilization finally slipped completely. His face twisted with rage as he grabbed her wrist, his fingers wrapping around it with deliberate force. "Listen here, sweetheart," he snarled, his grip tight enough to leave marks. "I pay for first-class service, and that means you do what I say when I say it." Diane tried to maintain her professional composure, but something in her eyes suggested she was fighting every trained instinct to handle this situation in a way that would compromise her cover. She attempted to extract her wrist from his grip, but Vanderkamp held on, enjoying her discomfort. Other passengers witnessed the assault but looked away, all except Frank, who was now standing despite Betty's worried protests, and the large man in seat 2A, who had placed his book aside entirely. The cabin filled with the kind of tense silence that precedes violence. "Maybe we should discuss your customer service skills in private," Vanderkamp continued, pulling Diane closer as his other hand reached toward her inappropriately. The threat was unmistakable, delivered with the casual cruelty of someone who believed his wealth made him untouchable. Frank took a step forward, his 70-year-old frame no match for a younger, larger man, but his conscience unwilling to stand by and watch. Betty grabbed his arm, whispering urgently about the danger, about his heart condition, about calling for help instead of confronting a man half his age. That's when Mike Tyson stood up, all 6 feet and 220 pounds. Of him rose with the fluid grace of a natural athlete, his movement economical and controlled. He didn't say anything yet, but his presence filled the cabin like a change in air pressure. The quiet authority he projected was so profound that even Vanderkamp's grip on Diane loosened slightly, as some primitive survival instinct warned him that the dynamic in the cabin had fundamentally shifted. The legendary fighter stepped into the aisle with deliberate calm, and for the first time in his life, Bradley Vanderkamp was about to learn what it felt like to be genuinely afraid. Mike moved into the aisle with the measured confidence of a man who had never needed to prove his toughness to anyone. Up close, his presence was even more imposing, not just his size, but the quiet authority of someone who had faced down the most dangerous opponents in the world and emerged victorious. "Excuse me, sir," he said, his voice carrying absolute command, despite its conversational volume. "The lady asked you to stop." Vanderkamp looked up, annoyed at the interruption but not recognizing the man who had just made him the focus of undivided attention. "Mind your own business, pal. This is between me and the help." The insult hung in the air as Mike took one measured step closer. "She's not the help. She's a professional doing her job. And right now, I'm making this my business." Something in Mike's tone finally penetrated Vanderkamp's alcohol-fueled arrogance. He released Diane's wrist, but remained belligerent, his wealthy man's entitlement warring with a growing sense that he might have miscalculated. "You want some of this, tough guy?" Vanderkamp started to stand, his movements clumsy with drink and rage. "I'll have you arrested for assault." That was his fatal mistake. Without violence, using only the leverage and pressure points learned from decades of training, Mike immobilized Vanderkamp with one hand. The technique was so smooth and effortless that most passengers barely saw it happen, just enough pressure applied to the right nerve clusters to make the executive's legs buckle and his voice catch. "We're going to sit down now," Mike said with the gentle firmness of a parent disciplining a child. "You're going to apologize to the lady, and then you're going to be quiet for the rest of the flight." Vanderkamp, suddenly aware he was completely outmatched, found himself guided back to his seat as if he weighed nothing. The casual display of controlled power was more terrifying than any show of brutality could have been. I apologize," he mumbled to Diane, his voice barely audible. Mike released his grip and returned to his seat, but the dynamic in the cabin had permanently shifted. Other passengers watched with expressions ranging from relief to amazement. Frank settled back into his seat with a satisfied nod, while Betty looked at their savior with new understanding. Captain Jerry Morrison emerged from the cockpit, having been alerted by his crew about the disturbance. The veteran pilot took one look at the scene, Vanderkamp sulking in his seat, other passengers looking relieved, and the large man calmly reopening his book, and immediately understood what had happened. "Everything all right back here?" Morrison asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. "Everything's fine now, Captain," Diane replied, her professional composure restored but her eyes showing deep gratitude as they briefly met Mike's. As Morrison returned to the cockpit, and the cabin settled into peaceful quiet, Diane approached seat 2A under the pretense of offering a complimentary drink. "Thank you for what you did," she said quietly. Most people would have looked the other way. Mike studied her face for a moment, his experienced eyes noting details that others might miss. "Most people aren't used to seeing bullies in action. You handled yourself well, like you've been trained for it." The question implicit in his statement made Diane hesitate just long enough to tell Mike there was more to her story than a flight attendant's uniform suggested. Word spread quietly through the first-class cabin, not with the celebrity gawking excitement that might accompany a typical famous passenger, but with the deep respect accorded to someone who had just used his reputation for genuine good. Frank Kowalski, whose detective instincts had been studying their helpful passenger throughout the confrontation, suddenly leaned toward his wife. "Betty," he whispered, his voice carrying a mixture of awe and recognition. "That's Mike Tyson." Betty looked more carefully at the man in seat 2A, taking in the powerful frame, the scarred hands, and the quiet authority that had just defused a dangerous situation with such effortless control. Her eyes widened as recognition dawned, the realization spread row by row, not through excited chatter, but through meaningful glances and respectful nods. These passengers understood they had witnessed something significant, a legend stepping forward to protect the innocent, just as he had done in countless fights throughout his career. Captain Morrison approached Mike's seat, extending his hand. With the respect one warrior shows another. Mr. Tyson, I want to thank you personally for what you did back there. It takes real character to step up like that. Mike shook the captain's hand firmly. Some lines shouldn't be crossed, Captain. Especially when decent people are just trying to do their jobs. My father always said you could judge a man's character by how he treats people who can't fight back, Morrison replied. He'd have been proud to see what happened here today. Other passengers nodded their agreement, creating a sense of community around the shared experience. The elderly couple smiled their gratitude, while a businessman in seat 3B quietly said, "Thank you, sir. That took real class." Mike accepted the thanks with gracious humility, deflecting attention back to the importance of standing up for others rather than celebrating his own actions. Meanwhile, Vanderkamp had retreated into sullen silence, but his phone buzzed constantly with incoming calls. He answered in hushed, angry tones, speaking about complications and unexpected delays with the desperation of a man whose carefully laid plans were unraveling. When the immediate gratitude subsided and passengers returned to their activities, Diane approached Mike's seat again, this time with genuine purpose beyond professional courtesy. "I meant what I said," she told him quietly. "Thank you. Most people see a situation like that and convince themselves it's not their business." Mike studied her face with the perceptive eyes of someone who had learned to read people under pressure. "You handled that situation like someone with training. Real training, not just airline customer service." Diane's slight hesitation before responding was barely perceptible, but Mike caught it. His street-smart instincts, honed by years of navigating dangerous situations both in and out of the ring, told him there was more to this flight attendant than met the eye. "I've dealt with difficult passengers before," she said carefully. "Not like that." "You haven't," Mike replied with quiet certainty, his tone making it clear he wasn't fooled by her deflection. Vanderkamp's phone conversations had become more frequent and increasingly desperate. The pharmaceutical executive huddled in his seat, trying to keep his voice down after the earlier humiliation, but stress was making him careless with his words. Frank Kowalski had positioned himself strategically, his 4 decades of police experience, teaching him how to eavesdrop without appearing to do so. What he heard made his blood run cold. "The shipment can't be delayed," Vanderkamp hissed into his phone. "The girls are getting restless, and the buyers won't wait." Frank's detective instincts screamed danger. This wasn't business terminology. It was the language of human trafficking, spoken with the casual indifference of someone who saw people as commodities. "New York operation depends on tonight's schedule," Vanderkamp continued. "Container ship leaves at midnight, and everything better be loaded by then." Betty noticed her husband's rigid posture and the way his hands had clenched into fists. 43 years of marriage had taught her to read Frank's moods, and right now he looked like a cop who had just stumbled onto a major crime. "The Port Authority contact better have the customs paperwork ready." Vanderkamp's voice carried just enough for Frank to catch the crucial details. "No inspections, no delays, no problems." Frank leaned toward Betty, his voice barely a whisper. "This bastard is talking about human trafficking. Girls, shipments, containers. I've heard this language too many times in missing persons cases." Betty's face went pale as the implications hit her. Their own granddaughter Melissa had disappeared 3 months ago, vanishing without a trace on her way home from school. The official investigation had stalled, leading Frank and Betty to pursue their own desperate search for answers. Mike had been observing the interactions with the heightened awareness that came from years of reading dangerous situations. When he noticed Frank's agitation and the way Diane kept finding excuses to walk past Vanderkamp's seat, his own suspicions crystallized. Frank made his decision and approached Mike during a moment when Diane was in the galley. "Mr. Tyson, I'm retired NYPD, 32 years on the force. That man is talking about something that sounds like human trafficking." Mike's expression hardened, his street-smart instincts confirming what Frank's professional experience had detected. "What exactly did you hear?" Frank shared the fragments of conversation he'd caught, and Mike's understanding of criminal behavior filled in the terrifying gaps. They were interrupted when Diane returned from the galley, having overheard enough to realize her carefully constructed cover might be in jeopardy, but the danger came from unexpected allies rather than enemies. As she looked at Mike and Frank's serious expressions, Diane realized that her months of undercover work had just intersected with two men who might be the help she desperately needed. The question was whether she could trust them with the truth about who she really was and why she was on this flight. Captain Morrison's voice crackled over the intercom, cutting through the cabin's tense quiet. Ladies and gentlemen, we've received word from air traffic control that due to security concerns at JFK, we'll be diverted to a smaller airport in Pennsylvania for additional screening. Mike's street instincts immediately screamed danger. In his years of navigating complex situations, he had learned to recognize when circumstances were being manipulated. This wasn't standard airline protocol. It was a setup that Diane's professional composure cracked slightly as the implications hit her. She had spent months building this operation, positioning herself on this specific flight to gather final evidence against Vanderkamp's network. Now they were being herded into hostile territory where his people would have control. Vanderkamp, meanwhile, looked satisfied rather than inconvenienced by the delay. While other passengers grumbled about missed connections, he smiled with the smugness of someone whose contingency plans were falling into place. Frank pieced it together first, his detective's mind connecting the dots. He called ahead. He said quietly to Mike and Diane as they huddled near the galley. His people are controlling where we land. The three realized they were walking into a trap, but the innocent passengers around them had no idea of the danger. Mike looked at the elderly couples, business travelers, and families who trusted that their flight would end safely in New York, not in some remote Pennsylvania airport where criminals waited. Diane made a critical decision. Her cover was blown. Anyway, and these two men had already proven they would stand up to injustice. "I need to tell you something," she said, glancing around to ensure they weren't overheard. "I'm not just a flight attendant." "Federal?" Frank asked, his cop instincts reading her body language. Diane nodded slightly. "FBI. I've been tracking Vanderkamp's operation for 8 months. This flight was supposed to be my chance to gather final evidence before we moved on his network." Mike absorbed this information with the calm of someone accustomed to unexpected developments. "Instead, we're flying into an ambush. His people will be waiting when we land," Diane confirmed. "They'll stage some kind of security incident to separate us from the other passengers and deal with the threats to their operation." As the plane began its descent toward the unscheduled landing, the three unlikely allies faced a terrible reality. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and heading into enemy territory. But they also had something Vanderkamp's people didn't expect: a legendary fighter, an experienced detective, and a federal agent who were all willing to risk everything to protect the innocent. "We need to be ready for anything when we land," Diane warned. Mike looked around the cabin at the trusting passengers, then back at his new allies. "Then we better be smarter than they are." The plane touched down at a small regional airport in rural Pennsylvania, its engines whining as Captain Morrison guided them to a remote section of tarmac. Through the small windows, passengers could see several black SUVs positioned around the landing area, far more security than a simple flight diversion would warrant. "Ladies and gentlemen," Morrison announced over the intercom, his voice carrying an undertone of concern, "please remain seated while federal agents conduct additional security screening." Diane used her knowledge of real federal protocols to confirm what Mike's instincts had already told him. "Those aren't legitimate agents," she whispered. "Real federal response would involve uniformed TSA, local police, and proper identification. This is Vanderkamp's people staging a fake operation." Mike recognized the setup from his years of navigating dangerous situations outside the ring. They were being contained while Vanderkamp's network adapted to eliminate the threat Diane represented to their operation. Frank's police experience helped him count the opposition through the windows, at least 8 men in tactical gear, positioned with military precision but lacking proper federal insignia. "Professional muscle," he muttered. "This isn't some street gang. These guys have real training." That's when Betty surprised everyone by speaking up with quiet determination. "Frank, show them the research." Frank looked at his wife with confusion, but Betty continued. "Tell them about Melissa, about why we're really on this flight." The revelation hit like a thunderbolt. Frank and Betty weren't tourists returning from a Vegas vacation. They were grandparents on a desperate mission. Their 16-year-old granddaughter, Melissa, had disappeared 3 months ago, and Betty's extensive internet research into missing persons cases had led them to travel this specific route, hoping to gather information about trafficking networks. Betty's been researching missing persons cases for months, Frank explained, his voice heavy with pain. She found patterns, connections between disappearances, and certain travel routes. We weren't in Vegas for fun, we were following leads. Betty opened her laptop, showing them files she had compiled with the methodical precision of her library science background. Maps, timelines, missing persons reports, and airline schedules, all cross-referenced with the dedication of a grandmother who refused to give up hope. Melissa Kowalski, 16 years old, disappeared walking home from school, Betty said, her voice steady despite the tears in her eyes. The police said she was probably a runaway, but I knew better. She was taken. Diane realized that Vanderkamp's operation was larger and more sophisticated than her investigation had revealed. Mike understood that this fight had become deeply personal for everyone involved, not just about stopping one criminal, but about saving innocent lives and reuniting broken families. As armed men approached the aircraft from multiple directions. Vanderkamp smiled across the cabin at them with the confidence of someone who believed his money and connections had finally solved his problems. "We're not waiting for them to come to us," Mike told the group quietly, his voice carrying the authority of a natural leader. "And we're not letting that bastard walk away from this." The real battle was about to begin. Curtis Brennan stepped out of the lead SUV with the efficient movements of a professional soldier. At 38, he carried himself with the cold precision of someone who had turned military training into a profitable career, eliminating problems for wealthy clients. 6 men in unmarked tactical gear flanked him as they approached the aircraft, their positioning and equipment screaming private military contractor rather than federal law enforcement. Captain Morrison received instructions through his radio to keep all passengers aboard while additional security measures were implemented. Brennan's voice came through the communications system identifying himself as Federal Agent Curtis, but he provided no badge numbers, agency identification, or proper authorization codes that real federal agents would use. Mike observed the men surrounding the plane through the small cabin windows, his experienced eyes immediately recognizing what Diane's training had already confirmed. Their body language, equipment selection, and tactical positioning were all wrong for legitimate federal agents. These were hired guns masquerading as law enforcement. "Military contractors," he said quietly to Frank and Diane. "Probably ex-special forces, definitely not federal." Diane monitored the radio chatter on her concealed federal communications device, confirming their worst fears. The frequencies being used weren't official channels, and the tactical language carried the efficiency of mercenaries rather than the procedural precision of real agents. Frank's police experience helped him assess their opposition, while Betty used her laptop to research the airport's layout, finding emergency exits and potential escape routes with a methodical precision that had made her an exceptional librarian. 6 vehicles, probably 8 to 10 men total, Frank reported. Professional-grade weapons and body armor. These aren't street thugs, they're military trained. Vanderkamp made no attempt to hide his satisfaction as he watched the operation unfold outside. His earlier humiliation was forgotten, replaced by the smugness of someone whose contingency plans were falling perfectly into place. "The containers better be loaded on schedule," he said into his phone, loud enough for the others to hear. "I don't care what it costs. Everything moves tonight as planned." Betty's research had revealed the airport's isolated location, minimal civilian staff, and limited law enforcement presence. "We're 20 miles from the nearest state police barracks," she reported quietly. "If we're going to get out of this, we'll have to do it ourselves." Brennan approached the aircraft door, flanked by 2 armed men. His cold eyes scanned the cabin through the windows, clearly identifying Mike, Diane, and the Kowalskis as the primary targets who needed to be neutralized. The aircraft door opened with a hydraulic hiss, and Brennan stepped aboard with the confidence of someone who believed overwhelming force would solve any resistance problem. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced in a voice that brooked no argument, "all passengers will be detained for enhanced security screening related to potential terrorist threats aboard this aircraft." His eyes lingered on Mike with particular interest, recognizing the legendary fighter, but confident that even Mike Tyson couldn't overcome professional military training and superior firepower. Mike rose from his seat as Vanderkamp started to follow Brennan toward the aircraft exit, his massive frame filling the narrow aisle and creating an immediate standoff. The confined space of the airplane cabin worked to his advantage. Only one person could approach him at a time, negating the numerical superiority Brennan's team enjoyed outside. "I don't think so," Mike said quietly, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had never backed down from a fight in his life. Brennan's hand moved instinctively toward his concealed weapon, but he hesitated. Killing Mike Tyson on an aircraft full of witnesses would create an international incident that no amount of money could cover up. The legendary boxer's reputation provided a shield that even professional killers had to respect. "Mr. Tyson," Brennan said with forced politeness, "I understand your concerns, but this is a federal security matter. Please step aside. Show me your federal credentials." Mike replied, not moving an inch from his position blocking the aisle. Frank stepped forward, producing his retired detective shield with the confidence of someone who knew how to project authority. "NYPD, 32 years. Those frequencies you're using aren't federal channels, and your tactical positioning is all wrong for legitimate law enforcement." Betty surprised everyone by calmly holding up her phone, which had been recording everything since the men surrounded the aircraft. "I've already uploaded this footage to cloud storage with automatic distribution to news outlets if I don't check in every 6 hours. Your federal operation is now documented evidence." Diane carefully revealed her actual federal credentials to Brennan, creating legal complications he clearly hadn't been prepared for. "Special Agent Martinez, FBI. This aircraft is now part of an ongoing federal investigation, and any interference constitutes obstruction of justice." The four unlikely allies had effectively cornered Brennan in a situation where his usual solutions, violence and intimidation, would create more problems than they solved. Mike's reputation, Frank's law enforcement credentials, Betty's documentation, and Diane's federal authority created a web of complications that even professional mercenaries couldn't simply shoot their way through. Brennan's cold eyes assessed the situation with military precision, recognizing that his straightforward plan had encountered unexpected resistance. These weren't helpless civilians. They were organized, intelligent, and willing to fight back. "You have 1 hour to come to your senses," he told Mike, his voice carrying the promise of violence. "After that, we solve this problem permanently." He gestured for Vanderkamp to follow him, but left 2 armed guards positioned outside the aircraft to ensure no one could escape. As they walked away, Vanderkamp looked back with the satisfaction of someone who believed temporary setbacks wouldn't prevent his ultimate victory. "Complications don't change the schedule," he said into his phone as they reached the SUVs. "The ship leaves at midnight whether these people cooperate or not." Diane turned to her new allies with grim determination. "There's something you need to know about tonight's operation. Vanderkamp's network is moving their largest shipment of trafficked women and girls to a cargo ship leaving New York Harbor. If we don't reach the city by midnight to stop it, dozens of lives will be lost forever." She paused, looking directly at Frank and Betty, "including potentially your granddaughter Melissa." With Brennan's men guarding the aircraft from outside, the team had temporary privacy to share critical intelligence. Diane opened her encrypted laptop, revealing files that painted a horrifying picture of Vanderkamp's sophisticated trafficking operation. "He uses his pharmaceutical company as legitimate cover," Diane explained, her screen showing shipping manifests, port authority records, and financial transactions. Legal contracts with ports across Eastern Europe and Southeast Asia provide perfect camouflage for moving human cargo. The scope of the operation was staggering. Vanderkamp's company had developed a network spanning multiple continents, using legitimate medical supply shipments to mask the transport of kidnapped women and girls. Tonight's operation represented the culmination of months of planning. 47 victims, aged 14 to 25, Diane continued, her voice heavy with the weight of what they were facing. "They've been held in facilities across New York and New Jersey, waiting for tonight's transfer." Frank and Betty's worst fears were confirmed when Diane showed them surveillance photographs recovered during her investigation. Among the dozens of faces was one that made Betty gasp and Frank's hands clench into fists. Melissa Kowalski, their 16-year-old granddaughter. "She was taken 3 months ago," Betty whispered, tears streaming down her face as she stared at the photograph. showing Melissa in what appeared to be a holding facility. We never stopped looking. The cargo ship, Baltic Promise, was scheduled to depart New York Harbor at 11:47 p.m., less than 8 hours away. Once it reached international waters, the victims would disappear forever into a network that had been operating with impunity for years. The ship flies Liberian flags and has diplomatic protection, Diane explained. Even if we alert the Coast Guard, jurisdictional issues and international law could delay intervention past the critical window. Mike studied the shipping schedules and port layouts on Diane's laptop, his strategic mind working through the logistics of what they were facing. This wasn't just about stopping one criminal or saving one flight. It was about dismantling a network that destroyed families and enslaved innocent people. How long from here to New York Harbor? He asked. By car, about 4 hours under normal conditions, Diane replied. But Brennan's people will try to stop us, and every minute of delay means those victims get closer to disappearing forever. Frank stared at his granddaughter's photograph with the focused intensity of someone who had dedicated his life to bringing missing people home. Melissa's been gone for 3 months. 3 months of not knowing if she was alive or dead, of wondering what they were doing to her. Betty placed a trembling hand on the laptop screen, touching her granddaughter's image. We came on this flight hoping to find leads, never dreaming we'd find her actual location. We're going to stop this, Mike told them with absolute certainty. All of it. Tonight. Diane warned them about the overwhelming odds they faced. My FBI backup is hours away, and even then, bureaucracy and jurisdictional politics could delay action until it's too late. The realization settled over all of them. They were on their own, facing a professional criminal network with international resources and dozens of innocent lives hanging in the balance. But they had something Vanderkamp's people didn't expect. A legendary fighter, an experienced detective, a brilliant researcher, and a federal agent who were all willing to risk everything to save the innocent. Mike formulated a plan that leveraged each team member's unique skills while using his legendary reputation as both weapon and shield. Outside, Brennan paced near the SUVs, speaking urgently into his radio as the 90-minute deadline he had set approached its conclusion. He's getting impatient, Frank observed, watching through the cabin windows. Military types don't like extended standoffs. They prefer decisive action. Mike understood that Brennan's training would eventually overcome his reluctance to harm a celebrity witness. They needed to act before the mercenary decided that eliminating Mike Tyson was worth the potential consequences. I'm going to give them something to focus on, Mike said, moving toward the aircraft door. While they're watching me, you work on our communications problem. He opened the door and stepped onto the mobile stairs, his presence immediately drawing the attention of every armed man on the tarmac. The psychological impact was exactly what he had intended. Even professional killers felt the weight of confronting a legend. You want to talk? Mike called out to Brennan. Let's talk. While Brennan's entire team focused on the potential threat, Mike represented, Frank used his police knowledge to locate the communication jamming equipment that had been preventing outside contact. The device was sophisticated but not undetectable to someone who had spent decades working with surveillance technology. Betty provided crucial technical support, using her research skills and surprising familiarity with electronic systems to help Frank identify the jamming frequency and find the device's vulnerability points. Library systems are more complex than people think, she explained as she guided Frank through the technical process. I've had to troubleshoot everything from wireless networks to digital security systems. Mike's confrontation with Brennan became a masterclass in psychological warfare. Without raising his voice or making threats, he reminded the mercenary of what happened to people who crossed Mike Tyson, not through bragging, but through the quiet confidence of someone who had never lost when it truly mattered. You know who I am, Mike said simply. You know what I'm capable of. The question is whether you're smart enough to walk away while you still can. Frank successfully disabled the jamming equipment just as alarms began sounding in Brennan's communication. Here, the restored contact triggered immediate alerts, letting Brennan know they had regained the ability to call for help. Diane used the restored communications to contact her FBI handlers, though she knew federal backup was still hours away. The important thing was that Brennan could no longer isolate them completely. Time's up, Brennan snarled into his radio, Is military discipline overcoming his reluctance to harm a celebrity? Storm the aircraft. No more games. Mike saw the tactical teams beginning to move and understood that the moment for talk had passed. He retreated up the stairs as armed men approached from multiple directions, their patience finally exhausted. "They're coming," he announced as he secured the aircraft door behind him. "Everyone ready?" Frank positioned himself at one of the emergency exits while Betty prepared to coordinate passenger evacuations. Diane checked her weapon and reviewed the aircraft's layout, preparing for a confined space battle that would test everyone's courage and skill. The narrow aisle of the aircraft would force Brennan's men to approach one at a time, giving Mike the tactical advantage he needed to turn his legendary fighting skills into an effective defensive strategy. "Time to find out if you're as tough as you think you are," Mike said quietly as the first mercenary reached the aircraft door. The battle for the plane and the lives of 47 innocent victims was about to begin. Mike's position in the aircraft's narrow aisle became a tactical masterpiece of defensive fighting. The confined space that had seemed like a limitation transformed into his greatest advantage. Brennan's men were forced to approach single file, negating their numerical superiority and turning the engagement into a series of one-on-one confrontations. The first mercenary through the door moved with professional confidence, his military training evident in his approach. But no amount of special forces experience had prepared him for facing Mike Tyson in a space where footwork and positioning mattered more than weapons. Mike's first strike was a textbook demonstration of adapted boxing technique. A short, devastating uppercut that lifted the man off his feet and sent him tumbling back down the aircraft stairs. The psychological impact on the remaining attackers was immediate and profound. The second man tried to use the distraction of his partner's fall to rush Mike's position, but the legendary fighter had spent decades reading opponents' intentions. A perfectly timed combination, jab, hook, body shot, dropped the mercenary before he could bring his weapon to bear. While Mike controlled the choke point with surgical precision, his teammates executed their parts of the escape plan with military efficiency. Frank sprinted across the tarmac toward the rental car lot, his police training helping him identify the fastest route while staying below the sight lines of Brennan's remaining men. Betty coordinated the passenger evacuation through the aircraft's emergency exits with the calm authority of someone who had spent a career managing complex logistics. Terrified civilians followed her instructions without question, her grandmother's demeanor providing reassurance even in the chaos of combat. Diane used her federal credentials to identify which airport personnel were legitimate and which were Brennan's plants, coordinating with real security to provide cover for the escaping passengers while maintaining communication with distant FBI backup. Frank's decades of police work included enough interaction with car thieves to know the basics of hot wiring older vehicles. A rental car from the 2010s provided exactly the right combination of accessible ignition systems and adequate performance for their escape needs. "Mike," Diane called out as Brennan regrouped his remaining men for a coordinated assault. "Time to go." The legendary fighter delivered one final combination that sent the third attacker sprawling, then moved toward the emergency exit with the fluid grace that had made him unstoppable in the ring. The confined space battle had lasted less than 3 minutes, but Mike had systematically neutralized half of Brennan's force without suffering a scratch. As the team converged on Frank's commandeered rental car, Brennan's voice echoed across the tarmac with military fury. "Run them off the road. No survivors." The black SUVs roared to life as Frank gunned the rental car toward the airport exit. Behind them, Brennan's remaining men piled into their vehicles, beginning a high-speed pursuit that would test every skill the unlikely allies possessed. The chase toward New York and toward 47 innocent lives hanging in the balance had begun. The rental car's engine screamed as Frank pushed it beyond safe limits, his police pursuit training keeping them ahead of the heavier SUVs on the winding Pennsylvania roads. Route 80 stretched ahead toward New York, but Brennan's vehicles were gaining ground with every mile. Mike had moved to the passenger seat, studying the side mirrors and preparing for the inevitable moment when running wouldn't be enough. His boxing instincts for reading opponents translated perfectly to vehicular combat, understanding timing, positioning, and the critical moment when defense had to become offense. "They're setting up for a pit maneuver," Frank announced, recognizing the tactical positioning from his years of police work, trying to spin us off the highway. The lead SUV accelerated alongside their car, its driver preparing to ram their rear quarter panel and send them tumbling into the median. But Frank's defensive driving experience and Mike's strategic thinking created a counter-move Brennan's men hadn't anticipated. "Brake hard now," Mike commanded. Frank slammed the brakes at precisely the right moment, causing the SUV to overshoot their position and lose the angle needed for the pit maneuver. The heavy vehicle's momentum carried it past them, exposing its vulnerable side. To a counterattack, ram his rear quarter panel, Mike instructed with the calm authority of someone who understood physics and leverage. Hard enough to spin him, not hard enough to kill. Frank's precisely executed impact sent the SUV spinning into the median barrier, its occupants stunned but alive. The second pursuing vehicle tried to box them in using a coordinated pincer movement. But Mike's tactical mind was already 3 moves ahead. "Take the next exit, then get back on the highway," he told Frank. "Force them to choose between following us or maintaining pursuit formation." The maneuver worked perfectly. Brennan's remaining vehicles had to break formation to follow them through the exit ramp system, losing their coordinated advantage and allowing Frank to regain distance through superior knowledge of pursuit tactics. Betty monitored police communications on her laptop, routing them around potential roadblocks while providing real-time traffic information. State police are responding to reports of the vehicle chase, but they're 20 minutes behind us. Diane coordinated with her FBI handlers through encrypted communications, but the harsh reality was that official help remained hours away. "We're on our own until we reach New York," she reported. The third SUV attempted one final aggressive move, trying to ram them from behind and force them off the highway. But Mike had learned to read the rhythm of vehicular combat, understanding exactly when to tell Frank to accelerate, brake, or change lanes. "Swerve left, then hard right," Mike commanded as the SUV closed in. Let his momentum work against him. Frank's driving sent the attacking vehicle skidding past them and into the guardrail, its front end crumpled but its occupants surviving the controlled crash, with 2 SUVs disabled and the third keeping a respectful distance. The team had gained a temporary advantage. But Diane's radio crackled with ominous news from her federal contacts. "They're setting up roadblocks ahead," she announced. Brennan called in favors with corrupt law enforcement contacts. "We're being herded into another trap." Mike studied the approaching lights of New York City, gleaming like a beacon of hope against the night sky. "Then we spring it on our terms," he said with quiet determination. As they approached the outskirts of the greatest city in America, the team prepared for what they knew would be their final confrontation before reaching the harbor where innocent lives waited for rescue. The team reached New York City limits at 9:23 p.m., having successfully evaded the roadblocks through Frank's knowledge of alternate routes and Betty's real-time research of traffic patterns. The familiar skyline had never looked more welcoming as they navigated through Queens toward the FBI coordination point in Brooklyn. That Diane's federal contacts had finally mobilized proper backup, with tactical teams positioning around the warehouse complex where her months of investigation indicated Vanderkamp's trafficking operation was centered. Black SUVs with genuine federal markings surrounded the target buildings as heavily armed agents prepared for coordinated raids. 3 facilities. Simultaneous entry, Diane reported as she coordinated with her supervisor via encrypted radio. Warehouses in Red Hook, Sunset Park, and Bay Ridge. Intelligence suggests the victims are being held in modified shipping containers. Mike felt the profound satisfaction that came from using his strength for genuine justice as federal agents. Moved into position. This was what true victory looked like. Not personal glory in a ring, but protecting innocent people who couldn't protect themselves. The raids unfolded with military precision. At 9:41 p.m., FBI tactical teams breached all 3 locations simultaneously, their coordinated assault overwhelming the minimal security Vanderkamp had left behind to guard what he considered a secondary operation. Vanderkamp himself was arrested at the primary Brooklyn facility as he attempted to flee through a back exit, his laptop and multiple phones seized as evidence. The pharmaceutical executive's arrogance crumbled as federal agents read him his rights, his wealthy man's entitlement finally meeting consequences he couldn't buy his way out of. 23 victims recovered. Came the initial report over. Diane's radio. Women and girls, aged 16 to 24, all alive and receiving medical attention. Frank and Betty held each other as the good news continued to pour in. Evidence recovered from the facilities included financial records, victim documentation, and communication logs that would destroy Vanderkamp's entire network across multiple states and countries. "We did it," Betty whispered, tears of relief streaming down her face. "We actually stopped them." Captain Morrison, who had remained with the aircraft under federal protection, called Mike personally to congratulate the team. Other passengers from the flight sent messages of gratitude, understanding that their uncomfortable experience had led to something far more important than their individual inconvenience. But as federal agents celebrated the successful raids and evidence collection, Diane's phone rang with an urgent call from her FBI supervisor. The expression on her face as she listened drained all celebration from the moment. She hung up and turned to her teammates with devastating news that would change everything they thought they had accomplished. "Vanderkamp's arrest triggered a dead man's switch protocol," she announced, her voice heavy with implications none of them had considered. "The facilities we raided were decoys. The real operation has already moved to Plan B." Mike's triumphant feeling evaporated as the scope of their enemy's sophistication became clear. They had been fighting shadows while the real horror continued elsewhere. "What Plan B?" Frank asked. Though his detective instincts already dreaded the answer, Diane's next words confirmed their worst fears. "The primary victims, including the most recent kidnappings, are already aboard a cargo ship in New York Harbor, and it's accelerating its departure schedule." The devastating scope of Vanderkamp's deception became clear as Diane explained the intelligence catastrophe they faced. The Brooklyn warehouses had been elaborate decoys, designed to be discovered if the primary operation was ever compromised. The real victims, 47 women and girls including the most recent kidnappings, were already locked in shipping containers aboard the cargo vessel Baltic Promise. The ship was scheduled to leave at 11:47 p.m., Diane reported, her voice tight with urgency. But Vanderkamp's arrest triggered their emergency protocols. "New departure time is 10:15 p.m., less than 30 minutes from now." Frank's worst fears crystallized as FBI surveillance confirmed that Melissa was among the victims loaded onto the ship just hours earlier. The photographs were grainy but unmistakable. His 16-year-old granddaughter, unconscious from drugs, being carried aboard in the arms of international criminals. Betty collapsed against her husband as the reality of how close they had come to success made the failure even more devastating. "We were so close," she whispered. "We thought we had won." Coast Guard units were en route, but the ship flew Liberian flags and carried diplomatic protection that prevented immediate boarding. Legal authorization for intervention could take hours they didn't have, trapped in bureaucratic procedures while innocent lives sailed toward international waters. Once they reached the 12-mile limit, they're beyond U.S. jurisdiction, Diane explained. The ship will likely transfer its human cargo to other vessels, making rescue virtually impossible. From the Brooklyn waterfront, they could see the Baltic Promise in the distance, its lights moving steadily toward the harbor mouth and freedom. The massive cargo vessel looked deceptively peaceful as it carried its horrific cargo toward international waters and a fate worse than death. Mike stared at the ship with the focused intensity that had made him legendary in the ring. Sometimes, being a champion meant facing fights that couldn't be won through official channels, battles that required going beyond the law to serve true justice. "Coast Guard can't board that ship," he said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of someone who understood what had to be done. "But they can't stop us from trying." The expression on his face told everyone that Mike Tyson was about to fight the most important battle of his life. Not for glory, not for money, but for the innocent lives disappearing into the darkness of New York Harbor. Frank looked at his granddaughter's photograph one final time, understanding that every minute of delay meant Melissa and the other victims moved closer to vanishing forever. Betty closed her laptop with quiet determination, her research skills having brought them this far, but now requiring action beyond anything she had ever imagined. Diane faced the career-defining choice between following federal protocol and violating every regulation she had sworn to uphold. Looking at the distant lights of the cargo ship, she understood that some battles couldn't be won through proper channels. The ship's horn echoed across the harbor as the Baltic Promise continued its steady progress toward international waters and the darkness beyond. 47 innocent lives were running out of time, and the only people who could save them were four unlikely allies willing to risk everything for justice. The most dangerous part of their mission was about to begin. That FBI agent Diane Martinez stood on the Brooklyn waterfront, her federal training warring with her conscience as she explained the impossible legal situation they faced. The lights of the Baltic Promise grew more distant with each passing minute, carrying 47 innocent lives toward a fate worse than death. International maritime law protects vessels in transit, she said, her voice lacking conviction despite the technical accuracy. The Coast Guard needs proper authorization to board a foreign-flagged ship, and diplomatic protocols could delay action for hours. Mike studied the harbor with the strategic mind that had made him a champion, understanding that sometimes justice required going beyond the boundaries that protected the guilty. How long until they reach international waters? 26 minutes, Diane replied, checking her watch with growing desperation. Frank and Betty stood together, their 43 years of marriage having taught them to find strength in shared purpose. The knowledge that their granddaughter Melissa was aboard that ship, drugged and helpless, made every second of bureaucratic delay feel like betrayal. "We can't wait for authorization that might never come," Frank said with the quiet determination of someone who had spent his career fighting for justice. "That's my granddaughter on that ship." Mike made the decision that would define him not as a boxing legend, but as a true champion of the innocent. "Sometimes being a fighter means taking battles that nobody else can fight," he said. "Coast Guard can't board that ship legally, but they can't stop us from trying." Betty surprised everyone by stepping forward with fierce resolve. "That's my granddaughter too. I'm not waiting on shore while she disappears forever." Diane faced the choice that would determine her entire career: follow federal protocol and watch innocent people vanish, or violate every regulation she had sworn to uphold in service of a higher justice. The distant ship lights made the decision for her. "I became a federal agent to save people, not to follow procedures that let criminals escape," she said, her voice steady with newfound purpose. That Mike's plan was audacious in its simplicity: use his connections from the boxing and entertainment world to acquire a fast boat, intercept the cargo ship before it reached international waters, and rescue the victims regardless of legal complications. "My friend Tony runs a marina in Red Hook," Mike explained. "Former heavyweight who trained with me in the 90s. He's got boats fast enough to catch that ship, and he doesn't ask too many questions." Frank immediately volunteered his police training and tactical experience. Betty insisted on coming despite the danger, her research skills and grandmother's determination making her invaluable to the mission. The team, a legendary boxer, a retired detective, a librarian grandmother, and a federal agent, committed to a mission that could end with all of them in prison, but might be the only way to save 47 innocent lives. As they hurried toward the marina, the Baltic Promise continued its steady progress toward freedom and the darkness beyond. Tony Castellano's marina in Red Hook buzzed with the controlled energy of preparation as Mike led the team through the maze of boats and equipment. The former heavyweight contender had asked no questions when Mike called, understanding that some favors transcended normal explanations. "Cigarette boat, twin engines, top speed 55 knots, Tony explained as he showed them the sleek vessel. "She'll catch anything in the harbor, but you better know what you're doing out there." Mike's years of success had created a network of people who owed him favors or simply respected what he represented. Tony was both a fighter who had shared training camps with the legend and a businessman who understood that some debts could never be repaid with money. Frank used his police contacts to acquire tactical equipment, calling in favors from cops who remembered his 32 years of dedicated service. Body armor, communications gear, and emergency medical supplies appeared with the efficiency of a system that took care of its own. Detective Martinez from Brooklyn PD, Frank explained to the team as he distributed equipment, worked missing persons with me for 15 years. He doesn't know exactly what we're doing, but he knows it's for something that matters. Betty's preparation showcased skills that decades of library management had developed into tactical intelligence gathering. Her laptop displayed harbor charts, tide tables, and the exact specifications of the Baltic Promise, including the most likely locations for shipping containers holding human cargo. Container ships load their most valuable cargo in the center. Holds, she explained, her research having covered everything from maritime engineering to human trafficking patterns. Maximum security, climate control, easiest to guard. Diane provided federal intelligence about the ship's crew composition and security protocols while coordinating with her FBI handlers to ensure backup would be ready when they brought victims to shore. Her federal authority would be crucial for handling the rescued victims legally. Ship's manifest shows a crew of 18, but intelligence suggests additional security personnel who aren't listed, she reported. Professional-grade opposition, probably armed with military weapons. Mike's role combined practical leadership with psychological warfare. His presence gave the team confidence, while his strategic thinking helped plan an approach that maximized their chances against overwhelming odds. "We go fast, we go quiet, and we go together," he told them as they prepared to board Tony's boat. "Nobody gets left behind. Not us, not them." Each team member checked their equipment one final time, understanding the magnitude of what they were attempting. Frank loaded his service weapon while Betty uploaded all their research to cloud storage. As insurance, Diane tested her federal communications, knowing she was about to cross lines that would change her career forever. Mike stood at the boat's controls, looking out at the harbor lights where the Baltic Promise continued its steady progress toward international waters. For the first time since his fighting days, he felt the pure clarity that came before a battle where everything meaningful was at stake. "Let's bring them home," he said simply, starting the powerful engines that would carry them into the most important fight of their lives. The cigarette boat cut through New York Harbor at maximum speed, its twin engines screaming as Tony's vessel closed the gap with the massive cargo ship. At 10:02 p.m., they had less than 13 minutes before the Baltic Promise reached the 12-mile limit and disappeared beyond American jurisdiction forever. Mike handled the boat's controls with the same focused intensity he had brought to championship fights, reading the harbor's currents and traffic patterns with natural instincts honed by years of high-performance living. The city lights reflected off the dark water as they raced toward their target. There, Frank pointed ahead, were the cargo ship's massive silhouette blocked out stars against the night sky. "She's bigger than I expected." The Baltic Promise rose from the water like a floating city, its deck lights creating an intimidating display of industrial power. But Mike had learned long ago that size meant nothing without heart, and this ship carried the darkest cargo imaginable. "Approach from the starboard side," Diane instructed, studying the vessel through binoculars. "Bridge crew will be focused on navigation. Security will be watching the port side toward the harbor entrance." Betty's research proved invaluable as she guided them to the ship's blind spot, using her knowledge of maritime engineering to identify the boarding point with the least exposure to observation. Cargo loading area, midships. Lowest freeboard, easiest climb. The actual boarding required all of Mike's physical capabilities and leadership skills. Using the boat's speed and agility, they intercepted the massive vessel from its blind spot, staying below the sight lines of the bridge while Frank's police experience helped them read security patterns from the ship's lighting. Mike went first, his strength and agility allowing him to leap from the fast-moving boat to the cargo ship's hull and secure a boarding line for the others. The physical demands were extreme, but his conditioning and determination made the impossible look routine. Frank followed with the careful precision of someone whose age demanded perfect technique, his police training helping him assess the ship's security while Betty surprised everyone with her own climbing ability and quiet courage. Diane brought up the rear, her federal training evident in the way she moved with tactical awareness, covering their approach while monitoring for threats. The team had successfully boarded one of the largest vessels in New York Harbor without detection that Betty's research guided them toward the container holds where the victims were most likely being held. Central cargo area, maximum security, climate controlled, she whispered as they moved through the ship's corridors. But as they navigated the maze of passageways and cargo areas, They encountered their first security patrol, three armed men who immediately recognized that the ship had been boarded by unauthorized personnel. The confined corridors and industrial environment created a tactical nightmare, but Mike had spent his entire career turning disadvantages into opportunities. The narrow spaces that limited movement also channeled opponents into his range. "Stay behind me," he told his team as the security guards reached for their weapons. "This is what I do." The fight they had been preparing for was about to begin, but now it was happening on a moving ship in the middle of New York Harbor, with innocent lives depending on their success and the clock running down toward international waters. Mike engaged the ship's security team in the narrow corridors with the controlled fury of someone fighting for something more important than any championship. His boxing skills, adapted for confined combat, turned the industrial passageways into a tactical advantage rather than a limitation. The first guard rushed him with military confidence, but no amount of training prepared him for facing Mike Tyson. In a space where footwork and leverage mattered more than weapons, a devastating uppercut lifted the man off his feet and sent him crashing into a bulkhead, unconscious before he hit the deck. Frank provided tactical support from behind, his police training helping him anticipate threats and guard the team's flanks while they moved deeper into the ship. Two more coming from the port corridor, he warned, his service weapon ready but hoping Mike's fists would be enough. The second and third guards tried to coordinate their attack, but Mike's ring experience had taught him to handle multiple opponents with systematic precision. A combination of jabs and body shots dropped both men within seconds. Their professional training no match for legendary skill applied with righteous purpose. Betty's research led them through the ship's maze to the container holds, where the true scope of the horror became clear. Modified shipping containers had been converted into mobile prisons, each one holding multiple victims in conditions that defied human dignity. The first container they opened revealed 12 women and girls, aged 16 to 23, locked in a metal box with minimal ventilation and no sanitation. Many showed signs of drug-induced sedation, their captors using chemical restraint to prevent resistance or escape attempts. Frank's detective experience helped him assess the victims' conditions while searching for his granddaughter among the faces that stared back with traumatized hope. When he found Melissa in the third container, his composure finally cracked. "Melissa," he whispered, gathering his unconscious granddaughter in his arms. "Grandpa's here. You're safe now." The 16-year-old was alive but heavily sedated, her body showing signs of the abuse and neglect that characterized Vanderkamp's operation. Betty's grandmother instincts took over as she began providing first aid and comfort to the rescued victims. "We need medical attention for all of them," Diane reported into her radio, coordinating with Coast Guard units that were finally responding to their unauthorized boarding. Severe dehydration, possible drug overdoses, signs of physical abuse. Mike continued clearing the ship of hostile forces while the team worked to free all the victims from their metal prisons. Each container revealed more evidence of Vanderkamp's network's cruelty. Women and girls stolen from their families and treated like cargo. The emotional weight of discovering the human cost drove Mike to a new level of controlled fury. This wasn't about one criminal or one ship. It was about dismantling a system that destroyed innocent lives for profit. "How many more containers?" he asked Betty as she consulted the ship's manifest. "At least 8 more," she replied, looking at the shipping documents with grim determination. "We're not leaving anyone behind." But time was running out. Coast Guard radio chatter indicated they had less than 5 minutes before the ship crossed into international waters, and the remaining security forces were regrouping for a final assault to protect their human cargo. The most dangerous part of the rescue was about to begin, with Mike facing his greatest challenge not in any boxing ring, but on the dark waters of New York Harbor, where innocence hung in the balance. The ship's captain, Dmitry Volkov, arrived with the vessel's remaining security force, 8 men armed with military-grade weapons who had no intention of allowing their human cargo to escape. The former Russian Navy officer moved with the cold efficiency of someone who had spent decades treating human lives as expendable commodities. "Kill them all," Volkov ordered in accented English, his scarred hands gesturing toward Mike and the team. "Dispose of the bodies at sea. The cargo must reach its destination." Mike faced the most dangerous fight of his life, not against one opponent, in a controlled ring, but against multiple armed adversaries in a life-or-death situation where innocent lives hung in the balance. But this wasn't the wild young fighter of his youth. This was a mature warrior who understood exactly how much force to use and when. The ship's narrow corridors became his ally as Mike systematically dismantled Volkov's security force. Each engagement was tactical and purposeful, disarming opponents, using the industrial environment as a weapon, protecting his teammates while eliminating threats with surgical precision that a guard with a tactical knife found himself disarmed by a perfectly timed combination that shattered his wrist and sent the blade skittering across the deck. Another man with a pistol discovered that Mike's legendary hand speed could close distance faster than most people could draw and fire. Frank provided sniper support with his service weapon, his police marksmanship training allowing him to disable threats at distance while Mike handled close-quarters combat. Betty continued coordinating victim evacuation, her calm voice guiding traumatized women and girls towards safety despite the violence erupting around them. Coast Guard vessels approaching, Diane reported through her radio. But they can't board until we secure the ship. Mike's progression through Volkov's forces showcased the full evolution of his fighting skills, not just physical dominance, but tactical intelligence that turned each corridor into a trap for his opponents. He used their own aggression against them, channeling decades of ring experience into real-world combat. The final confrontation came when Volkov himself blocked their path to the last container holds, a military knife in his hands and murder in his cold gray eyes. This wasn't just about stopping the rescue. It was about preserving a criminal empire built on human misery. "You should have minded your own business, American," Volkov snarled, advancing with the confidence of someone who had killed before and expected to kill again. That Mike's response was simple and devastating. "This is my business. These people are under my protection now." Their battle represented more than personal combat. It was the clash between those who used strength to victimize the innocent and those who used it to protect them. When Mike finally defeated Volkov with a combination that sent the ship's captain crashing into a bulkhead, it wasn't just a physical victory, but a moral one that the legendary fighter had fully transformed into the protector he was always meant to be. With the ship's hostile forces neutralized, the focus shifted to the rescue operation's emotional heart, reuniting families torn apart by Vanderkamp's criminal network. Coast Guard vessels surrounded the Baltic Promise as Mike's team coordinated the evacuation of all 47 victims from their metal prisons. Frank knelt beside Melissa as she began to regain consciousness from the drugs, her recognition of her grandfather creating one of the mission's most powerful moments. "Grandpa," she whispered, her voice weak but filled with hope she had never abandoned. "I'm here, sweetheart," Frank replied, tears streaming down his weathered face. "Grandma and I never stopped looking for you. You're safe now." Betty provided maternal comfort to victims who hadn't experienced kindness in months, her grandmother's instincts helping calm their terror while Coast Guard medics provided emergency medical care. The rescued women and girls responded to her gentle voice with the trust that comes from recognizing genuine compassion. Mike personally carried victims who were too weak to walk, his gentleness with the traumatized women and girls contrasting powerfully with the violence he had used to save them. Each rescue was performed with the careful attention of someone who understood that these people had endured horrors beyond imagination. "You're safe," he told each victim as he helped them toward the Coast Guard rescue boats. "Nobody's going to hurt you anymore." Diane coordinated with the arriving federal agents to ensure proper medical care and legal protection for all the victims. Her unauthorized mission had saved 47 lives, and the evidence recovered from the ship would destroy Vanderkamp's network completely. Frank and Melissa's reunion deepened as she regained full consciousness, her 3 months of captivity ending in the safety of her grandfather's arms. "I knew you'd find me," she whispered. "I never stopped believing." Betty documented everything with the methodical precision that had made her an exceptional librarian, ensuring that the victims' stories would be told and their trauma would lead to justice rather than silence. The container holds revealed evidence that went far beyond Vanderkamp's operation: financial records, victim documentation, and communication logs that implicated criminal networks across multiple countries. The rescue had uncovered an international conspiracy that law enforcement agencies would spend years dismantling. That AS Coast Guard vessels towed the Baltic Promise back to New York Harbor. All 47 victims were successfully evacuated to safety. Mike stood on the deck, watching the rescue operation with the satisfaction of someone who had used his gifts for their highest purpose. The immediate mission was complete, but the impact would resonate far beyond this single night. 47 families would be reunited, an international criminal network would face justice, and 4 unlikely allies had proven that ordinary people could accomplish extraordinary things when they refused to accept injustice. Frank held Melissa close as they boarded the Coast Guard vessel, understanding that his granddaughter's nightmare was finally over. Betty smiled through her tears, knowing that her research skills and determination had helped save not just their family, but dozens of others. The real victory belonged to all of them. The Baltic Promise was towed into New York Harbor under full Coast Guard escort, its crew and security forces in federal custody, while evidence teams began the massive task of documenting Vanderkamp's international criminal enterprise. The ship's cargo holds revealed a treasure trove of evidence that would destroy the trafficking network completely. Diane's unauthorized mission was vindicated by the overwhelming scope of what they had uncovered. Her FBI superiors, faced with 47 rescued victims and evidence of crimes spanning multiple continents, chose to commend rather than prosecute her violations of federal protocol. Agent Martinez's actions, while technically outside proper channels, resulted in the largest human trafficking bust in Bureau history. FBI Director Sarah Chun announced at the press conference. Her courage and initiative saved dozens of lives and dismantled an international criminal conspiracy. Frank's testimony provided crucial evidence for the criminal cases that would follow, his police experience helping prosecutors understand the sophisticated methods Vanderkamp's network had used to evade detection for years. The retired detective's persistence in searching for his granddaughter had uncovered a conspiracy that spanned 3 continents. The Vanderkamp's network crumbled as authorities used the recovered evidence to arrest accomplices across multiple states and countries. Financial records revealed connections to legitimate businesses, corrupt officials, and criminal organizations that law enforcement had been tracking for years. 17 arrests in 6 countries, Diane reported as the investigation expanded. Bank accounts frozen, legitimate businesses seized, and enough evidence to ensure life sentences for the primary conspirators. Mike deflected media attention from his role in the rescue, preferring to let the focus remain on the victims and their recovery rather than his celebrity involvement. When reporters pressed him for details, he simply said, "Sometimes you see something wrong and you have to step up. That's what anyone should do." The legal aftermath unfolded with satisfying swiftness. Vanderkamp faced federal charges for human trafficking, kidnapping, conspiracy, and racketeering that would ensure he never saw freedom again. Captain Volkov and his crew faced similar charges, with additional counts for attempted murder and international maritime crimes. The rescued victims received comprehensive federal protection and support services, with many choosing to testify against their captors to prevent other families from experiencing similar trauma. Melissa Kowalski became one of the most compelling witnesses, her courage in speaking publicly about her ordeal inspiring other survivors to come forward. "They took 3 months of my life," she told the court during Vanderkamp's sentencing hearing. "But they didn't take my voice, and they didn't take my hope. I'm testifying so this never happens to anyone else." Betty established a victim support foundation using the skills she had developed during their investigation, helping other families navigate the complex process of recovering missing loved ones. Frank worked with federal agencies to improve missing persons protocols based on what they had learned. Mike, Frank, Betty, and Diane gathered one final time as the legal proceedings concluded, understanding that their unlikely partnership had created bonds that would last forever. They had accomplished something that mattered, not just stopping criminals, but proving that ordinary people could make an extraordinary difference when they refused to accept injustice. "We did something real," Mike said simply, and the others understood they had been part of something larger than any individual achievement. 3 weeks after the rescue, Mike arrived at the Bronx Community Center where he had originally been scheduled to appear before the flight that changed everything. The youth boxing charity event had been rescheduled, and Mike was finally able to fulfill his commitment to the community that had shaped his early career. The gymnasium buzzed with excitement as young boxers and their families gathered to hear from the legend. But this event would be different from any speaking engagement Mike had ever done. Today, he would share the stage with someone whose courage had inspired him. Melissa Kowalski stepped up to the microphone with the quiet strength of someone who had survived unimaginable trauma and chosen to transform it into purpose. Her decision to speak publicly about survivor strength and the importance of never giving up hope had made her a powerful advocate for missing persons awareness. 3 months ago, I thought my life was over, she told the assembled crowd. But I learned that hope is stronger than fear, and that there are people in this world who will never stop fighting for what's right. Mike watched with pride as this 16-year-old girl demonstrated more courage than most adults would ever need, using her experience to help others understand that survival was possible and that trauma didn't have to define a person's future. Frank and Betty sat in the front row, their pride in their granddaughter evident to everyone in the gymnasium. They had decided to dedicate their retirement to volunteering with missing persons organizations, using Frank's investigative skills and Betty's research abilities to help other families find their lost loved ones. Diane continued her federal law enforcement career with new purpose, having been promoted to lead a specialized human trafficking task force. Her experience with Vanderkamp's network had taught her that sometimes the most important victories happened outside normal channels. When Mike took the microphone, he looked out at the young faces staring back with admiration and respect. These kids saw him as a boxing legend, but he wanted them to understand something more important than athletic achievement. Being a champion isn't about how hard you can hit, he told them, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had learned life's most important lessons. It's about who you choose to protect and what you're willing to sacrifice for people who need your help. He told them about the most important fight of his life, one that happened not in a ring, but at 30,000 feet and on the waters of New York Harbor. The young boxers listened with rapt attention as Mike explained that true strength came from character and purpose rather than just physical ability. I won a lot of fights in my career, Mike continued, but the victory I'm most proud of happened when I stood up for someone who couldn't protect herself. That's what real champions do. As the event concluded, Mike spent time with individual young fighters, teaching them techniques and sharing wisdom about boxing and life. Frank, Betty, Melissa, and Diane joined him, their unlikely family forged through shared purpose and mutual respect. The story ended with Mike watching the young boxers practice, understanding that his greatest legacy wouldn't be his victories in the ring, but the example he set for others about using strength in service of justice. Sometimes the most important battles were fought by ordinary people who chose to do extraordinary things when confronted with injustice. True champions, Mike had learned, were made not by winning fights, but by protecting those who couldn't protect themselves. If you like the story, please watch another story on our channel and subscribe to the channel.